You looked me in the eye and called me un-American. Say it again. Say it so the cameras can hear. Say it to the millions of Americans who look like me. The words rang out across room 226 of the Dirksen Senate Office Building like a gunshot in a cathedral. Silence followed. Not polite, not empty, but tense. Alive. Every head turned. Staffers froze. Aides gripped pens mid-note. Even the stenographer's fingers stopped on the keyboard for a beat too long. Tim Scott, standing at the front, blinked. He hadn't expected Zohran Mamdani to speak. He hadn't expected Zohran Mamdani to be there at all. This was a budget oversight hearing, a dry procedural slog meant for accountants and lobbyists, not confrontation. And certainly not confrontation with a man like him. Zohran, a New York State Assemblyman, hadn't been scheduled to testify. But the committee had allowed external observers, and Zohran had quietly taken a seat in the back row early that morning, unnoticed except by a few staffers. He sat with a notebook and a calm face, like a student studying the chaos of power. That calm shattered when Senator Scott, speaking about increased funding for border enforcement, made what sounded like an offhanded comment. It's time we stopped letting radical state politicians redefine what it means to be an American. The room kept moving, as if it hadn't registered. But Zohran did register it, and more importantly, so did his microphone. He stood, not rushed, not angry, just deliberate. I think the senator may have been referring to me, he said, steady voice echoing slightly against the walls of the wood-paneled chamber. Tim Scott forced a half smile. Mr. Mamdani, this isn't the time or place for personal grievances. Zohran didn't move. Then let's keep it political. I'd like to respond to the record. There was a pause. The air smelled like paper and nerves. The committee chair looked uncertain, but all eyes were already on them. The cameras were already rolling. So Senator Scott nodded smugly. 2 minutes, Zohran said. Zohran walked to the witness table. No notes, no script. He began not with a rebuttal, but with a story of a woman named Fatima in Queens, who hadn't left her apartment in 4 months after her husband was picked up by ICE for a misdemeanor. Of children growing up afraid of sirens, of surveillance vans outside mosques, of being followed into stores, of being told to go back to your country in the same city they were born. This hearing wants to talk about federal spending, Zohran said. But what you're funding is fear. What you're building with our taxes is not just walls and drones, it's the quiet terror that haunts millions of us every day. A beat passed, and then, thinking his mic was off, Scott muttered at it. This is why we can't let people like that define America. He didn't shout, he didn't need to. The words were quiet, but they were enough. Enough for the microphone. Enough for Zohran. Enough for every single person watching that live stream to hear. Zohran turned, slowly. You looked me in the eye and called me un-American, he said. Say it again. Say it to the camera. Say it so the people you work for can hear what you think of them. The room was no longer just a chamber. It was a fault line. Everyone felt it shift. Scott stood now, his expression tight. Let's not get emotional. Zohran smiled sadly. It's not emotion. It's experience. Outside that room, Twitter had already exploded. CNN had cut away from their broadcast to stream the clip live. In coffee shops, airports, waiting rooms across the country, people watched a moment they didn't know they'd been waiting for. A man who refused to swallow the insult, who stood and made them say it again. And somewhere in the background, Jasmine Crockett had just turned up the volume on her TV. Don't just scroll past this. If what just happened makes you feel anything, drop a comment. Let your voice be louder than theirs. And if you want more moments like this one, hit that subscribe. We're just getting started. By the time Zohran Mamdani stepped outside room 226 for a 10-minute recess, the air had shifted. Not just inside the Dirksen Senate Office Building, but across the country. Clips of the confrontation had already gone viral. Headlines were forming in real time. You looked me in the eye and called me un-American was trending above celebrity gossip and breaking international news. But back in the hallway, away from the hum of cameras, Zohran wasn't celebrating. He was still, focused, listening. He knew what would come next. They'd paint him as aggressive, as theatrical, as divisive. That was always the price of telling the truth too directly. Inside, Senator Tim Scott was pacing. Aides huddled around him, whispering damage control strategies. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between rage and confusion, like a man who had suddenly lost control of a story he thought he was writing alone. But the hearing wasn't over, and Zohran wasn't finished. When the committee reconvened, Senator Scott tried to reset the tone. "We're here to examine federal resource allocation, not stage political theater," he said. "Let's keep it professional." But professionalism, as Zohran would soon show, isn't the absence of emotion. It's the presence of truth under pressure. "I appreciate the reminder, Senator," Zohran said, now back at the table. "Since we're talking about allocation, I'd like to know why $1.7 billion is going toward border surveillance technology while entire districts in my state lack clean water infrastructure. Is that the American value we're defending? Cameras in the desert over clean taps in the Bronx?" Scott didn't answer, so Zohran pressed again. "What do you call protecting the nation? Many of us call policing our identities. And if we're un-American for questioning it, then maybe it's time we redefine what American means." The room shifted again. This wasn't shouting. It was worse for his opponents. It was surgical. Scott tried to pivot. "You know, Assemblyman Mamdani, I wasn't questioning your citizenship." Zohran leaned forward. "You questioned my belonging." A pause, and then he added, "That's always been the trick, hasn't it? You don't need to revoke our papers. Just make us feel like our place here is temporary, conditional, fragile." The power of that moment wasn't just in the words, it was in how Zohran said them. Not like a politician trying to score points, but like someone who had lived every syllable of what he was saying. Outside the building, Jasmine Crockett had already called her staff. "Tell them to pull the clip, full quality, don't cut anything," she said, and set up a meeting with Mamdani. Today. Back inside room 226, a young intern sitting in the corner, quiet, unnoticed, was crying. Not loudly, just a few tears, discreetly wiped away. Because for the first time in her professional life, she saw herself in the testimony. Her last name, her skin, her silence finally mirrored by a man refusing to flinch. And then it happened again. Another offhand comment. This time not from Scott, but from Senator Wilcox, an older member of the committee seated 2 chairs down. "They always make it about race," he muttered to his aide, unaware or uncaring that his mic was still on. The room tensed. Zohran's gaze didn't move. He heard it. He filed it. But this time he didn't respond. Not yet. Because something bigger was forming. After the session ended, a reporter caught up with Zohran in the hallway. "What do you say to those calling your comments today disrespectful?" Zohran paused, then said, "If respect means silence, I'd rather be rude." His phone buzzed. A message from Jasmine Crockett. "Meet me in the Capitol. We need to talk." This wasn't over. Not even close. If you're following this story and it hits something in your gut, don't just stay quiet. Leave a comment. Let them see how many of us refuse to be erased. And if you're here for the full truth, go ahead. Subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Zohran Mamdani walked into the Capitol building not like a politician chasing headlines, but like a man walking straight into a storm he had already chosen. Jasmine Crockett was waiting in a quiet conference room just off the rotunda, her phone on the table, screen flashing every few seconds with new messages, mentions, alerts. She looked up as he entered. No smile, no greeting, just, "Do you understand what you did back there?" Zohran sat across from her. "I didn't plan it, if that's what you're asking." Jasmine didn't look convinced. "You didn't plan to humiliate a sitting senator on national television? To turn a budget hearing into a referendum on American identity?" "I planned to listen," he said. "They gave me more than I expected." She studied him for a second longer, then nodded. "Good." What followed wasn't a strategy session, it was a reckoning. They laid it all out, the policies, the media framing, the ways progressives were always forced to explain, to apologize, to water down their truths so they wouldn't sound too radical, too brown, too foreign. Jasmine was tired of it. So was Zohran. "This hearing isn't about numbers," she said. "It's about erasure. And they didn't expect you to resist it, especially not like that. Now they're scared." Zohran raised an eyebrow. Scared of me? She shook her head. Scared of what you represent. A man with no patience for pageantry. A man they can't control with backroom flattery or public shame. And then she said the thing that changed everything. I want you back in that room tomorrow, as my witness. Zohran hesitated. They'll block it. Let them try, Jasmine said. We'll force the vote. On record. If they say no, they'll answer for it. He didn't speak right away. The weight of what she was asking settled in his chest. Not just political, but personal. This wasn't just about responding to slander. This was about making it impossible to ignore the voices they'd always pushed aside. Back in room 226, meanwhile, panic was quietly brewing. Tim Scott had received over 18,000 emails in less than 24 hours. Most weren't kind. Conservative networks tried to spin the moment, calling Zohran disruptive, a plant, a threat to order. But the clip kept circulating. The rawness of it, the silence afterward, the look in Scott's eyes when Mamdani didn't back down. And the younger generation wasn't buying the spin. Students were posting reaction videos. Activists were stitching his words into songs. Someone even started printing t-shirts. Say it again. Say it to the camera. Zohran's words were no longer his. They had become a current, and the system wasn't prepared to hold it back. Late that night, alone in his hotel room, Zohran sat by the window, looking out at Washington's pale orange lights. He could hear sirens in the distance, occasional laughter from a nearby suite, but mostly it was quiet. He opened his notebook, wrote down 3 words. Belonging is battle. Then, without thinking, he turned to a fresh page and began writing what he would say if they let him speak again. Not to defend himself, but to make sure the country heard what no one else at that table would say, that sometimes patriotism sounds like defiance, that sometimes America looks like the people it tries to ignore, that sometimes the most American thing you can do is refuse to be silent. If these words reach you, don't just let them pass through. Leave a comment. Be part of this story. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because we're not done telling the truth. The next morning, room 226 felt different. The wood walls were the same, the lights just as harsh, the chairs just as stiff, but something in the air had shifted. Everyone knew it, even those pretending not to. Reporters whispered behind phones, committee aides passed notes. There was tension in the silence, like before a verdict. Or a riot. Tim Scott sat at the head of the table, tie tight, jaw tighter. He had rehearsed his tone, controlled every syllable in the mirror, and still he looked like a man hoping the cameras wouldn't catch the sweat just below his collar. He cleared his throat. Today's hearing will proceed as scheduled. I'd like to remind all attendees, this is not a platform for grandstanding. But the moment Zohran Mamdani entered the room, escorted by Jasmine Crockett, every camera swung toward him like they had minds of their own. He wasn't supposed to be here. Technically, he wasn't on the witness list. But Jasmine had worked the rules. She'd pushed it through committee with one unexpected procedural move. And now Zohran was seated at the center table, nameplate freshly printed, a glass of untouched water beside it. He didn't flinch. Scott tried to move on. Our first topic today is the Department of Homeland Security's expenditure reporting. Jasmine interrupted. Mr. Chairman, before we begin, I'd like to yield my time to Assemblyman Mamdani. There was a beat. Scott opened his mouth, but the microphones were already live. The room was watching. America was watching. He nodded, tense. Very well, Mr. Mamdani, you may proceed. Zohran didn't look at notes. He didn't shuffle papers or clear his throat. He just began. I wasn't born in this building. I wasn't born into its rituals, its passwords, its costumes. I was born thousands of miles away, in Kampala, Uganda, to parents who believed that speaking truth to power wasn't a career. It was survival. He paused, let it sit. When I came to America, I came with the dream that justice was louder than a tradition, that facts mattered more than feelings, that if you showed up with courage and clarity, this country would meet you halfway. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Tim Scott's. I was wrong. He turned back to the room. I sit here today not because I was invited, but because I would dare to show up. Because someone in this very room looked me in the eye and called me un-American. Because someone forgot that you don't get to define American by skin tone, accent, or birthplace. His voice rose, but never lost control. You get to define it by action, by sacrifice, by principle. And if standing here and refusing to be erased makes me un-American in your eyes, then I accept the label. But let me be very clear. Your discomfort with my identity is not my problem to fix. There were no coughs, no murmurs. Even the camera operator stopped blinking. My name is Zohran Mamdani, he said finally, and I am as American as your silence. And that was it. No applause, no walk-off. Just a man who refused to be less than the full truth of who he was. Later that evening on the Capitol steps, Jasmine Crockett stood beside him. Dozens of reporters gathered, mics out, cameras flashing. One journalist asked, Assemblyman Mamdani, what do you say to critics who claim today's hearing was hijacked for political theater? Zohran paused, smiled slightly. I'd say theater has always been political, but today wasn't a performance, it was a mirror. A second reporter, what happens now? Jasmine answered this time. Now, she said, now we build something they can't ignore. Now we stop waiting for seats and start building the table ourselves. That night, hashtags flooded every feed. Tara as American as Mamdani. Say it again, our silence is not neutral. And for one brief moment, in a city built on hierarchy and hush, a man like Zohran Mamdani didn't just speak, he was heard. If this story moves something in you, don't just close the tab. Speak up in the comments. And if you believe voices like this need to be louder, hit that subscribe. Because silence is easy, truth is not.